Hi, my name is Ray Chang, and I serve as the Executive Director of the 10 by 10 Collaboration, as well as the President of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And we are so excited to bring this conversation to you to talk about the Asian American church and whether the Asian American church matters. I'm here with two amazing guests, but before I introduce them, for those who don't know what 10 by 10 is, 10 by 10 is a collaborative initiative seeking to make faith matter more for 10 million young people over the next 10 years as it responds to a disaffiliation of young people at the rate of over 1 million per year. Yeah. And so we are trying to shift the drift and stop the drop by addressing this disaffiliation crisis. And one of the things that we believe is by leaning into the realities of a multi-ethnic, multicultural world and a church that is designed by God to be multi-ethnic and multicultural. Dr. Sharon Kim, and Pastor Charles Choe, I'm so glad to be together. Can you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sharon Kim, and I teach sociology at Cal State University Fullerton. My husband, David, and I, we planted a church this year, actually. We're celebrating our 30 years. Yeah, and it's called the Garden Church. It's in the San Fernando Valley. And just a joy to be here.
And you're really OGs, in terms of second-gen led church plants.
Yeah, we were actually really young. We were 25 years old. And we were, I think one of the first second-generation church planters at that time. Yeah, and by God's grace, we made it to 30 years this year.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, and I'm very good friends with Pastor David of Garden. Hi, I'm Charles Choe. I lead a church called Tapestry LA Church, SN Downtown. We just celebrated our 10th year, not as many as 30, but it's been an exciting 10 years. The Lord's been really gracious to us, and we've experienced a lot of favor.
Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you for multiple reasons. But before we kind of dive in, it's important to note that all three of us are Korean American, and so we know that the Asian American population is a very diverse population made up of many ethnicities, and speaking many languages. But we wanted to kind of zone in to kind of create the Korean American realities, in large part because sometimes it's helpful to hone in on a specific ethnic group within the Asian diaspora. The other kind of unique thing is none of us are currently at first-gen immigrant churches, but I'm sure that all of us have experienced first-gen immigrant Korean church realities. And so we're going to bring that into the conversation a little bit. And all of us are a part of either primarily Asian American or Asian American dominant churches, which will shape some of our perspective going into this discussion. But I want to open up with this question. Does it matter that the Asian American church exists? Why or why not?
Do you want to go first? I'll defer.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It does matter. I think the Asian American church provides something. I think when you think about Asian American spirituality, there's discernible Asian cultural fingerprints in the way that we practice our spirituality. So for the church to exist, to contain, and also to, in a way, invent, right, this sort of hybrid spirituality, I think it's very, very important. In my research, I looked at 22 different churches in the Los Angeles, Southern California area, and really found that for Asian American Christians, rather than remaining within their immigrant parents' churches or going into mainstream churches, white churches, they decide to creatively fashion their own churches because within these Asian American churches, their unique identities are understood, are celebrated, are embraced, and they can practice spirituality in a way that is authentic to them.
Maybe I could just add to that a story that sort of tells us there's a need for an Asian American church. I have friends over on the west side, and it's mostly like a white church, a white dominant church, and the pastor of that church wanted to have a friendship and reached out, and we did some pulpit exchange, and we had teams come and visit each other's churches. And there was one young lady who was Asian American descent who came to visit our church, and after service, she came to me after experiencing worship, and she started weeping. And I thought something was wrong, but she was so delighted. And her words were, I forgot just how good it felt to see my own people up on stage. And something about just seeing Asian Americans on stage, people that looked like her, just stirred her, and it evoked something. I think a lot of us I sense a lot of us feel that way. Like in some ways we feel a bit homeless, and we're searching, and the Asian American church can be a home for a lot of us who are a little lost, I feel like.
That's good. So, I mean, we're all kind of articulating the affirmative that the Asian American church absolutely matters, that there is a unique place and contribution to the greater body of Christ that the Asian American church kind of offers. But Charles, one of the things that you shared is about the representation piece, the significance of seeing yourself in the community. And I think a big part of the representation piece is because we often feel so unseen. One of the things I'm always saying to people is that Asian Americans aren't invisible. We're just persistently invisibilized. Right? When we speak, our voices are muted. It's not because we're not saying anything. It's because they're oftentimes drowned out or completely ignored. When we're present, sometimes we're cast to the side. And that's a pretty common experience that a lot of Asian Americans report on. But beyond representation, you also articulated that we have unique spiritualities, that we have unique practices. I'm curious, what are some unique practices or spiritualities that Asian American kind of bring to the table? Or maybe even more specifically, Korean Americans, because all three of us are Korean, knowing that there are other practices that are brought to the communities and to the broader body of Christ that aren't represented in this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to speak to my research, and with the pastors that I interviewed, several of the pastors who started their own second-generation Korean American churches, there's a real desire among them to not be carbon copies of their immigrant parents' church, but they certainly don't want to be carbon copies of white evangelical churches as well. But they really want to adopt, almost improvisationally, adopt aspects of both spiritualities, which they feel are the positives or the best of them. And in my conversations, I think, especially what most of the pastors focus on is this understanding of collectivity, community, that American, Christianity is hyper individualistic to a fault. And that within their churches, they want to really embrace the biblical understanding of community, that it's not just me and God, right? That it's we and God. And that Asian culture, or Korean culture in this sense, has a better understanding of that, has a better practice, a historical, cultural practice of understanding that it's us, it's not just me, that we live in community, and that matters, right? So I think that's one element that Korean American or Asian American church spirituality, that's a gift that we offer. That it's practiced within the churches that I studied.
Can I lean into that?
Sure.
So, what does that look like? What does it tangibly look like to be more individualistic or more collectively oriented? How does it show up in the community, for example? I mean,
I'm thinking, like, as a Korean American, it's a unique sort of position. I feel like it's this idea of integration, where I'm not necessarily Korean, and I'm not necessarily American. And the combination of the two makes me somewhat unique, which means I have something unique to offer the church. I think historically, people like myself, who grew up in the Korean church and who've worked in the Korean church, we battled our own sort of resentment and feeling like a little homeless, a little invisible to our first generation church. But, in my own journey, when I wrestle through my own calling and where I might want to serve, like just the idea of serving an American church felt a little daunting. It wasn't something that was appealing to me. And I found myself perhaps even thinking like maybe ministry isn't for me because I'm not quite at home. And, but once I recognized my own sort of identity as a uniquely Korean American person, and I have something to contribute to the conversation, I felt like I was able to sort of have my own standing, or to be able to speak to the church in a way that could be helpful. So just like owning up to my own identity, I think was important. Just like recognizing who I am, that I'm unique. And then I would just say like, the idea of like, in some ways, maybe this is a bias, like there is the unique contribution is like we recognize the values of like a collective identity, because that's what we were taught in our sort of Korean tradition. But at the same time, because we're raised and educated here, we see the importance of that individual freedom, that individual identity, and being able to bring the two together. I think it's actually, I think that's a little more consistent with the scriptures, I feel like. And that's what I feel like we can contribute to the conversation. Like, how do you manage and navigate between those two spaces? I think both are important. So, for example, I realized that at our church early on, people were really craving community. And I thought back to like, even in Korea, these mega churches, what they do well is actually their cell groups. Their small groups are, it's where life happens, and it's where, it's like the engine of the church. And I felt like, okay, that's where I need to really focus, because I see that the people are coming and they're looking for community. And if we can really strengthen our community experience and those bite sizes and those cell group experience, I felt like people would continue to come. And so one thing that we've seen, every year, throughout the 10 years, small group signups are actually larger than our Sunday attendance. And they taper down to about like 90% attendance. But I mean, that's really surprised us. And I think that's something that is something that we develop because we are uniquely Korean American.
Yeah. And to go along with what, I absolutely agree. I think there's that real desire for community, small groups, that kind of community. I've also noticed that, especially within the church that I serve at, my husband and I serve at, that decisions that people make, their day-to-day decisions, what kind of job am I going to get? Who am I going to date and marry? Those decisions, if you think about it in an American concept, well, heck, I'm an individual. I'm a free agent. I can make my decision, but not so in an Asian American context, because those decisions impact our parents, it impacts our siblings, it impacts other relationships. So even the way people make decisions, it's very communal, right? So I think those are the type of things, those are the types of things that Asian American churches understand. So when they're ministering to people, when we're ministering to people in our congregations, we have a fuller understanding that even something as simple as decision making, it's not an individual making a decision just about his or her own life, but that individual is embedded within a community, and that community influences the decisions that we make. So it comes down to even very simple things like that we see the Asian culture and sensibility show up in the way we practice religion.
Yeah, it's almost to what Charles said about, living a more integrative life, that you can't just see them as an individual, but you have to see the systems and the structures around them. What both of you are sharing is fascinating, because, on the one hand, what you said, Charles, is that, this kind of some would call a hyphenated experience or existence, where we're not fully quote unquote American, which is oftentimes conflated to be white American, or we're not fully quote unquote Korean or first generation immigrant Korean or Asian, American in general. means that we're not as polarized as others may be if they are in some ways like more monocultural in their existence or a part of the dominant culture. And so we can kind of calibrate and make sure that we're not going too far into the extremes and draw the best from or even take the worst from both communities or both kind of dispositions. And then, to what you were saying, Sharon, that there are ways in which the everyday decisions that maybe are not as conscious because they're so ingrained within us are impacted simply because of our cultural upbringing, our relationships with our family, the expectations and the cultural expectations that are imposed on us or adopted and embraced by us really are part of our broader spiritual existence, our spiritual life, and our spiritual reality. There are a lot of Asian American Christians that are wrestling with the idea of how important it is for them to either uncover, unlock, become aware of, lean into their Asian American identity or their specific ethnic identity. And others were saying, well, no, we're kind of in this, what used to be called a melting pot. Now it's called a mosaic or more of a salad of cultures. What do you think about that, especially in the Christian context? As Korean Americans, as Asian Americans, are we supposed to preserve our ethnic identity? Are we supposed to lean into our, racial identities? Or are we trying to distance ourselves for the sake of something different?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, should I jump in first?
Sure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the parts that are consistent with Scripture or the Gospel, I think we should do our best to retain them, because I think it's, in some way, it supersedes culture. And I'll give one example. Like, I remember growing up in the Korean church, how much I resented morning prayer. I think a lot of second-gen people would feel the same way. And just the feeling like you were somehow like failing as a pastor or as a leader if you didn't go to morning prayer all the time.
And it's like, what time is morning prayer?
At 5:30.
5 or 6
5 or 6 a.m.
My father-in-law still goes to morning prayer every day except for one day a year.
Yeah.
What day of the year is that?
It's Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. You celebrate
morning prayer.
That's such determination, dedication.
Yeah. And it's a good thing that they're so dedicated. They say the church was built on prayer, the Korean church. But I just remember feeling, but this isn't me. And then, when I was younger, I would refer to like, none of my seminary professors teach this. This isn't part of like the spirituality that I'm familiar with. And I would rebel in that way. And I think there was a lack of wisdom and just seeing what I wanted and what I thought was best for me and not willing to listen and learn. So now, like with a little bit more age, as an older person, having led a church for a while now, and having been on my own journey with prayer and seeing the importance of it, a lot of it is what my parents used to say, the importance of prayer in life and in ministry. But I think what's different is, like, I don't feel enslaved to it, nor do I feel the need to call people to it in a way that enslaves them. Mm-hmm. So we made it more reasonable in the sense that, let's do it at 7 a.m. in the morning, and not every day. Let's create a rhythm in the church like it's every other day, and let's do it like sometime in the morning, sometime in the day, sometime in the evening, and just kind of create this sort of habit and rhythm for people. And if they don't come, they don't come, but it's open. It's available for you. And I am actually very surprised that more people, younger people, are interested in prayer. They're willing to come at 7 a.m. And I think some of that is just like, we learned that from our parents. Maybe we resented it. We were dragged to it, but there's something about it that we can see the value in. And I think the second generation church, the Asian American church, can teach our young people how to pray like our parents, but in a way that's more liberating and healthy and that gives life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and going back to what you were sharing about the different models, the salad bowl, the mosaic, and the melting pot, I think what makes our situation as Asian Americans so unique and complicated is the fact that when we talk about ethnic identity, it involves choice, right? You choose how much of your ethnic identity you want to retain.
Yeah.
But when it comes to racial identity, the element of choice gets a lot more complicated because the melting pot worked for white ethnic groups, but for non-white ethnics, for groups of color, it wasn't something we could choose, right? To be part of that melting pot, if there ever was in the United States. So for Asian Americans, the reality is our racial identity, it's real, it matters, it affects us on a day-to-day level, and we can't get away from it. It's not something you can choose. And as Asian Americans, I mean, one of the biggest stereotypes or harmful, right, stereotypes is the perpetual foreigner, right? That no matter how, our families could have been here for generations, since the 1800s. But in some ways, none of that really matters as long as you look Asian, right? And that's why we get, questions like, where are you from? Why is your English so great? That as Asian Americans, as racial minorities, this element of choice, that we can choose to just strip ourselves of our ethnic identities, our cultural identities, our racial identities, we actually don't have that choice, at least in this point in American society. So that is a reality that's a very complicated but very real part of our lives and it influences our churches. So that's something I think has to be an important part of the conversation as well.
Well, you are the resident sociologist. There are a lot of people that oftentimes conflate race, culture, and ethnicity. Can you give like a brief distinction? What's the difference between all three?
Yeah, okay, I'll just give in a nutshell. When we talk about ethnicity, it's about those cultural variables, like what country you've come from, what kind of food you eat, your customs, your values. That's what we talk about when we say ethnic identity. Your racial identity is an identity in the United States that is defined by how you look primarily. It's based on your physical characteristics, skin color, eye shape. And it is something that, for the most part, it is a racial categorization for the purpose of exclusion. That has been historically the case. So it's very important to note that my Korean American ethnic identity is distinct from my Asian American racial identity. Those are different categories.
Yeah. In many ways, our face is our race.
Yes.
Right? And so how we are seen is often prescribed value to, and then either viewed as inferior, superior. If we're talking about our racial identity, but then our ethnic identity is more aligned with our lineage, our ancestry,
country of origin.
Countries of origin. Now, both of you are ministering at Pan-Asian, multi-ethnic, multicultural churches. Your church is 95% Asian, but then even among the Asian American population, you have a sizable Chinese population, a majority Korean population, and then you also have some Southeast Asians, South Asians that participate. And then your church is 30% non-Asian.
About 25%.
Oh, 25%.
Yeah, I would say. We didn't actually do a demographic survey yet, but I would say just visually, it'd be about 25% non-Asian.
And then the majority, I'm assuming, are Korean?
Not anymore.
No, not anymore.
Not
okay.
anymore. Yeah. I would think about half Chinese and Korean.
Yeah. So in both of your half Chinese, Korean, and then what's the other quarter?
Other Asian, Filipino.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the 25% is other Asian, Filipino.
The 25% would be non-Asian.
Oh, non-Asian.
Right.
Okay. 25%. And then mostly white, Latino.
Latino, I would think. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And you minister in the kind of the LA area, LA basin, Northridge, and then in downtown LA. As you grow in this diversity, how do you negotiate with your ethnic kind of identity and culture, as well as engage or not engage with the kind of racialized realities that we've inherited, that are imposed on us? Do you are in what ways do you kind of navigate that or engage with those things?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, as a local church pastor, I wouldn't say that I did a lot of justice work or even have thought about it or read on it. I was just trying to survive, serve my people and get them to love God and just be on mission for God. I kept things rather simple, I felt like. I mean, there were pain points I felt like throughout my journey, but I largely ignored it, didn't really investigate it. And for a while, I kind of bemoaned that I wasn't more multicultural at the church, but I kind of learned to accept the line that you just kind of draw your own kind. So I just thought things were the way they were, and that most churches were going to be that way. And then COVID hit, and I had an experience that kind of woke me up. So this is during the lockdown, and all you can do is sort of take walks with your family in the neighborhood. And we're on one of those walks, and I see a truck pulling up right next to us and slows down to an almost complete stop, and just for no reason gives me the bird. Just flips me off. And I was so stunned because nothing like that has ever happened to me. And this is in front of my small kids and my wife. And I was so shocked. It almost like paralyzed me for a second. And then immediately I was flushed with anger. And then that sense of helplessness, right? This is in my own neighborhood. These are my neighbors flipping me off because of COVID, because the way I look, and essentially blaming people like myself for what's happening with the pandemic. That kind of started my journey into wanting to understand. Why is this happening? Why are the people at my church so angry? Why are they so divided? What do I do with this BLM? How do I speak to it as a pastor? And at the very minimum, I felt the Lord say to me, it's not quite your moment to speak. I want you to take a season to learn. Even if you don't agree, listen and learn from others who are kind of telling their story, their own experience. And just kind of taking that time to do that really opened my eyes to some things that I didn't really think about. I didn't feel like I had the bandwidth or the interest, but start reading authors, reading on issues that related to it. And I realized during that time, the Asian American church actually has something to say to the situation. So like discovering that voice, and being on that journey with the handful of people at the church, it was at times controversial. I certainly lost people because they thought that I was becoming progressive. Some in the church thought I was too conservative, that I wasn't speaking out enough. So just kind of navigating that space, as an Asian American, was an important part of my journey as a pastor. And then learning to lead my people alongside just speaking to what justice is and how do we talk about it in the Asian American church? How do we speak to people who are just all about evangelism and not about justice? So that's been a very important part for me. I would say just like learning and hearing and understanding. The Black community have said to America, we experience public spaces very differently from you guys. I didn't quite understand that until I had my own. And that created this level of empathy and the willingness to kind of dive into this conversation. So I think just embodying it, learning and taking a humble posture and willing to lead people in a gentle way, and knowing that people are going to have divergent views. And yet, I think this is part of the fight, what it means to declare the gospel to the world. And so that's been my experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I think the posture of humble curiosity, I think is so important as Asian Americans to have humble curiosity for people who are not Asian Americans who come to our churches. Now, for me personally, I've experienced, I think, two sort of approaches when I think about my non-Asian Christian friends. right? At one level, there are those who say, oh, race doesn't matter, Sharon. We're both, children of God. We're both Christians, and that's all that matters. So I don't see you as an Asian. I just see you as a fellow sister in Christ. That's problematic. And to her perspective, I think she felt that that's great. That's the pinnacle of identity, right? And at one level, yeah, but then if you don't see me, and you don't see my Asian identity, you don't see the history, you don't see the racism that I've experienced throughout my life, you don't know me if you don't see me as an Asian American. So there's one camp, I've experienced. I think another approach that has been very uncomfortable for me is when they would say, Sharon, I know all about Asian American Christians. I know all about Korean American Christians because I have a good friend. So based on that one friend and everything that friend told me, I know everything about you. I know what you went through. I know what it's like to be a Korean American Christian, right? I'm like, no, you don't, right? So I think there's two sort of kind of very polar opposite perspectives that are really not helpful, right? But really taking more a posture of humble curiosity. That your experience is probably very different from mine. Yeah. And I want to know. I want to learn. Tell me what it was like. Yeah. Tell me what your journey has been like. And for them to have that humble curiosity, I think is huge. And also for myself to have that same posture. As I said, we have about 25% in our church who are non-Asian. And I want to know their experience. I want to know what it's like. To be in their shoes, to have their journey, and to have that humble curiosity, I think is just really huge and important. Yeah.
I mean, so this is not atypical, right? I mean, Sharon, you're sharing that you've experienced you've experienced racism in a very noticeable manner. Yes. Charles, you're saying, I don't know if I've experienced a lot of racism until maybe COVID. I mean, my own experience during COVID was that, I went to Walmart when we first when things started opening back up. And I just remember someone pointing at me, and there was two white women. They were just pointing at me and saying, whispering to themselves. And I overheard them saying, oh, there's another one. And I'm looking around like, another what? And I'm like, the only distinctive marker was that I wasn't Asian. I was like, oh, are others not wearing a hat? Or others wearing a jacket? I'm like, what's different? I'm like, the only thing I can tell was that my racial features were the only distinctive features. Something similar happened to me with the drive-by. So I was sitting outside on my yard. Someone was driving by in a pickup truck, and they pointed at me, and they basically said, get the expletive out of here, you yellow piece of feces. And, at that point, I was like, oh my, they know where I live. Like, we have a window. It's easy to throw something through the window. My wife is inside. Do we feel safe? And so asking those kind of questions. But, of course, that wasn't, for me at least, the first time I experienced. Then you have our congregations, which are oftentimes split around whether we lean into issues of race or we pretend like they don't really exist, because, one of the biggest things we heard early on was that we were making too big of a deal of racism and anti-Asian racism until the Atlanta shootings took place. And then they were like, oh my goodness, all the especially the Asian American women in our congregations are upset at us because we're not saying anything. And pastors were like, we need to start thinking about how to engage with this. And we know that because of some of the forces, that there's always like a tendency for people to want us to not engage with these issues, because at least pretending like they don't exist means that things can continue on in some ways, or that they might just go away if they're not named in an explicit manner. When I talk to young people, especially because of their awareness around COVID, their increased consciousness at a younger age around what anti-Asian racism looks like. And so, for example, when I was growing up, people would ching-chong me. They would make kind of these comments that for me, I thought was an acceptable part of reality. Like, my upbringing means that, these type of comments are normal. Like, I shouldn't feel weird when someone says Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. It came with the territory of being an Asian American.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know if I knew what an Asian American was. I just thought, oh yeah, they just don't even know what a Korean is. And so I'm saying, I'm not Japanese, I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean. And they were like, I don't know. The young people today, they know what Koreans are, thanks to BTS and thanks to K-dramas and Squid Game and all the other things that have infiltrated the media. And they're more proud of being Korean or Chinese than I felt like I was afforded to be when I was growing up. And they're less tolerant of discrimination and prejudice, in part because they've become much more sensitized to discrimination and prejudice in ways that we were told, just pretend like it doesn't exist, put your head down, move on. Young people are leaving the church, and it's true within the Asian American context as well. About 27% of all Asian Americans are categorized as nones or atheist, agnostic, or don't identify with any religious tradition. Among those that are 18 to 34, that number jumps to the mid 30%. Right? And so AACC is going to release a series of reports that shows this. So younger people are disaffiliating faster than older people. At the same time, Koreans are, within the Asian diaspora, among the fastest disaffiliating group. And I think a part of it is because churches don't speak into their ethnic and racial identities or create space for this reality that, or this identity for them that's very important to thrive and flourish. What is the role of ethnic, cultural, racial identity development, or even racial justice issues in discipleship, especially within the Asian American context? Is there one? Is there not one? What do we do? What's so funny?
No, nothing's funny. I'm just, my cogs in my wheel. I need some time to do kind of thing. I'm always thinking about.
I can jump in.
Okay.
I'm being a good Asian deferring here, but I think part of my job as a preacher, as a pastor, in some ways I would agree with this notion that, our job is to preach the gospel and not have to worry about like social justice issues. But I think therein lies a bit of a lack of imagination on what the gospel is. That's the problem. What we're selling, what we're giving our congregation is a truncated gospel. I want to fight for social justice because of the gospel, because to not care for the poor or even systems that perpetually keep people impoverished or somehow discriminated from generation to generation. For me as a preacher, that's a gospel issue. That's like shortening our understanding of the gospel. Let me rephrase that. That's like giving somebody the message that the only thing that matters is your relationship to God and the way you do your quiet time and, and just simply loving your neighbor. But in what ways? Are we understanding that our neighbors are hurting because sometimes it's for historic reasons. It's because there are systems in place that continue to undervalue certain people, certain segments of our society. I think the gospel speaks to that. The gospel has to speak to that because it's for the transformation of not just the individual, but a collection of individuals, which is what society is. And I feel like churches that are all about like, that's not our fight. That's not what we're supposed to engage in. That's giving them an abridged version or a short version of what the gospel truly is supposed to be. And it's a lack of discipleship in the church where it's just about your relationship to Christ and it's not about like transforming society. So it's my love for the gospel and my belief that it's the answer to what ails the world, the problems of our society, which includes social and justice. That's why I feel the need to call our people to be concerned about the lack of justice in our society.
And I think it's important, before Sharon, you start answering the question, I think it's important to remember that the term social justice actually emerged from the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It was a term that priests that had designated to address the injustices that were taking place outside of simply the home or simply within the church, and to move out of a spirit-led conviction to spread the kingdom of God on earth. And I think a lot of people forget that the term social justice is actually a Christian term that has been hijacked in many ways and adulterated by Christians.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the younger generation. We're talking here, Gen Z.
Gen Beta just started this year.
Wow.
That's right.
Wow, yeah. And what is it that they're hungering for? I think living out Christian faith in a way that is appealing and relevant, right? And I think Charles mentioned that as well. What I do see that I lament a bit in Asian American churches, it is this preoccupation with upward mobility. It's this preoccupation of let's get our kids into the best colleges that we can get them into. Let's have comfortable lifestyles. I'm not saying all Asian American churches are like that, but I know a lot that are. Mm-hmm. So that's the preoccupation. That's the high value. And I think that there is a hunger among the younger generation to see Christianity, to see the faith lived out in a different way. Yeah. A faith that's lived out in, caring for the poor and oppressed. There are over 2,000 Bible verses. God identifies with the poor and the oppressed. Mm-hmm. To see their parents, to see the older generation model spirituality in a way that goes beyond just simple upward mobility, comfort. So that's something I think that's really important. I think another thing that's really important is for churches, Asian American churches, to tackle the hard questions, not just say, hey, come and listen to another Bible story. Because that's really not doing it. Yeah. It's not relevant. It's not doing anything for them. But really let's bring the real questions and let's really tackle the real questions, the questions that matter, the questions that they are finding answers to outside of the church. The church needs to embrace that. I think also empowering the younger generation, giving them a voice. Yeah. Although, because I consider myself 1.5 generation, right? Some would say I'm second generation because I immigrated at, such a young age. But
1.9 generation.
1.9 generation. And I'd like to think of myself as I'm more, open-minded or more progressive. But no, if I really take an honest look, I do see that some of my parents' generation's ethos or mindsets, it does affect the way I make decisions, the way I allocate responsibility, decision-making power, all of that. So I think the younger generation, they're hungering for more shared leadership, collaborative leadership, more empowering, more respect for their voice. So I think there are some shifts that just overall that need to happen within Asian American churches to make sure that we are really touching and meeting the needs and discipling well that next generation. So we need to do a real hard and honest self-evaluation assessment of how we're leading, how we're discipling, how we're doing church. Is it really meeting the needs? Is it really doing an effective job of discipling the next generation?
I feel like it's of course they want a seat at the table. We did. And, there's always, I think, a time when we need to listen more. And, going back to this question of why are they leaving the church? Why are they identifying with the nuns? Maybe, during the recent wars in Israel, with Palestine, we had a handful of students who were out on campuses protesting, and it was messy. And that was another issue the church was trying to navigate. And we would hear from time to time, somebody would say, I hope the pastor addresses this issue on the pulpit. And we find ourselves wanting to be non-political because it's just easier. And generally that is the posture because we know that it can be very divisive. But some things are not just like easy to just say it's political, so we're not going to touch it, because there, I think, matters that are dear to God, like issues of like the oppressed and the innocents being killed without the ability to defend themselves, even if they're different from us in religion. I feel like there's a prophetic voice that the church has to offer in moments like that. And so I resonate with the college students who say, why aren't you speaking on this? This is important to us. This is relevant. This is the most relevant thing at the moment. Like everyone's talking about it. The church is ignoring it. I think there is a place for these conversations to take place. But what I want to say to that young lady who's insisting, like, the church say something denouncing Israel or maybe Palestine. Like, what I want to say is, like, even with Black Lives Matter, I understand, like, there's some things about what you're saying is right and correct, but your understanding of what justice is feels like it takes you only so far, and you'll never accomplish this picture of biblical justice. And that's the alternative that I think the church can offer if we're willing to speak to it. And I feel like a lot of pastors were a little hesitant and unwilling just because it's so controversial. But I think it's important to try to create safe spaces for that young lady to want to have this conversation and maybe see it as an opportunity to learn something new and have a more holistic vision of shalom and peace and a better understanding of history. Like, the church has to speak to it instead of just saying, let's just worry about your relationship to God and doing well and just loving your neighbor. These are the issues that matter to our young people, and they are driving people out because the church feels irrelevant. So that's been a challenge, but it's something that I'm more and more willing to have conversations around.
So what you're saying is that we need to engage these issues with wisdom.
Yeah.
The second part of, this whole question is it just, there are two ways of looking at it. One is right, or both of them could be right. Or is there a more right way, whether it's issues around, what's happening in the Middle East, or, what's happening to African Americans from the Asian American context. Like, is there a definitive line in which we have to draw, which we have to place in the ground and say, no, you have to be on this side of justice? Or do we say no? And then we complicate that a little bit. I know a Palestinian Korean Christian, and she attends a church that's in the Southern California area. And for her, she grew up mostly in Korean context, where she felt like, of all these things, which one, when you play the game, which one doesn't belong, and there's one that kind of breaks out of the mold. It's like she felt like that all the time because she was mostly in the Korean context, and she had to kind of suppress her Palestinian identity. Wow. And so in her church, when the attacks on Gaza broke out, she wondered, especially because she knew that she had family, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank, like, would the church speak up? Do you think it matters if there are people within our community that are coming from these groups, so whether they're African American or they're Palestinian, or does it not matter if we are insulated from the group to still speak up on it because it affects fellow human beings at a broader level, but also fellow Christians at a more narrow level who might just be down the street from us. And I don't know if this is the right way to ask the question, but I'm trying to push to say, do we need to lean into more of our prophetic voices or to speak to issues that might not directly affect us, but affect those around us?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where, the challenge of being a pastor, it's a tough call. It needs a lot of wisdom, God's wisdom, and courage, and hard work to get into, because sometimes these topics that come up require a lot of time to research, because you want to give an informed position. It's not even so much a position, but an informed voice based on the truth of God's word. That's the foundation, but also based on knowledge. So it takes time to learn. I mean, pastors are having to speak on all kinds of things that
they might have PhDs in everything, but no time.
And that's the challenge. That's the challenge. I mean, you have to spend hours to really even come up to speed with some of the issues that come up. So it's daunting. Yeah. And I think from the parishioner's point of view, there has to be some grace and understanding that the pastor does not have to be an expert in everything. Mm-hmm. But the pastor could glean from God's wisdom and the wisdom found in the Bible, but also has that responsibility, especially if there are members in their church that it involves, as a pastor, as a person who cares for the people that you're leading, to get informed and to make it a priority to learn. Right? So it is a tough situation that I think all pastors sit in, to be able to speak about these issues that they might not know much about.
And I think that's an important perspective, because I don't think most people realize that their pastors are not omniscient people.
They're not.
That they don't have a pulse on everything. And all of a sudden, for many pastors, there was this new wave of you needing to be an expert on everything and speak perfectly to everything, or else you will get canceled.
Right.
At the same time, I wonder, especially for Asian Americans, if that's a function of our truncated education through our seminaries, through our own church experiences, or the discipleship that we've also experienced. Mm-hmm. Where, let me give you that. So when I talk to members of the Black church that are near to the poor, or leaders of the Black church that are near to the poor and near to the realities that the Black church has had to endure through and persevere through, they can speak with much more clarity, with much more conviction, and even kind of having frameworks, simply because it's the tradition that had raised them.
Right.
I think for a lot of Asian American Christians that are more within the Protestant or Protestant evangelical frame, we learned a lot from the white evangelical church, which was very limited in its understanding of how the church and Christian leaders are called to engage with the world. And so I wonder if we have to move back a layer in order to kind of discern, or like reimagine, as you were saying, in terms of how we do ministry now, so that future generations of ministers aren't replicating our deficiencies in some ways, if they are deficiencies. I don't know if you have a response to anything that was just shared.
Yeah, I want to maybe relate another story here. So there was so we planted a church in Dallas, and we sent a handful of people, and I had gone to visit and speak there, and it happened to be during the time of the Middle East crisis, and I was just speaking to like the Imago Dei. That we have to value, and that everyone deserves a level of protection. That innocent people can't just be slaughtered because of a political agenda or your view of eschatology. And I was just speaking into that space, and And afterwards, it turned out one of the members that left our church to go and help plant was Palestinian. I had no idea. He married a Korean at our church. I just didn't realize he was Palestinian. And he started to weep to say, this is the first time I heard a pastor give us dignity. And I just felt like we have to start, when it comes to like justice issues, at the very minimum, we can at least humanize people, I feel like. And for me, to humanize isn't to necessarily agree, whether it's the LGBTQ community or people that you differ on political issues, but just the simple willingness to listen, to give them a voice, to see them as valuable people who are made in the image of God. And I think that feels like sometimes it's just enough. Like they don't need you to agree with everything. They know that the church kind of comes from a certain perspective. They have certain sense of morality. I found that just humanizing and creating spaces, even at the church, allowing, for something like Spaces, which is a ministry at our church where we advertise as, this is not a teaching space. We're not asking you to believe things that we believe, but a space for you to come and just talk about your issues. Whether it's a new mom going through the difficulties of being a first-time mother, or somebody who's struggling with a sexual orientation or their gender identity. We've been able to create these spaces. We're in downtown Los Angeles near a couple of campuses. So a lot of people are struggling with these things, trying to make sense of it. And instead of just kind of coming down hard for not lining up with the traditional views or orthodox views, we feel like creating spaces for people to just have conversations and having a lending ear as a church, as a representative of the church. I feel like it does something for them in their journey. And I feel like those little ministries that seem insignificant can go a long way in a person's journey with God. I don't know if that's answering anything, but yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I'm hearing you share, which is really important, is to be a physical expression of God's love.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
to be a place where people feel and sense that they are people of worth and value.
Yes.
And that God loves them and doesn't condemn or judge.
And that's literally who Jesus is, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
And to create spaces like that, that's very beautiful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's helpful, especially because we don't know the fullness of everyone's story. We don't know what people are carrying. We don't know the wounds they've received in and out of the church. We don't know the harm they've experienced from their family members. We don't know the current sufferings that they're dealing with. And quite frankly, we don't know what we already agree with them on and all the ways in which we disagree and yet are still called to walk with each other and be in fellowship with each other if we are all within the body of Christ and if we all profess Jesus as Lord. Mm-hmm. This has been a rich conversation, but as you're thinking about younger generations and especially thinking about the Asian American Christianity and church experience, church expression, or the existence of the Asian American church, what are some things that what's one or two things that you'd want those in ministry positions to consider as they move about ministry to and with young Asian Americans, whether they're Christian or not?
What do you want them to know?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much. I don't know. I think there is, when I see my people, and a lot of them are young, we're a very young church. I think there's a lot of willingness, for the things of God. I think they are ready to be led, and they're ready to lead. I think they have resources. They've been blessed with opportunities in education and their
Can you just let them know that we're still recording and we can hear them?
She's trying to open the door, huh? Is it locked again?
oh.
Okay. That they're willing to lead.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to offer, and a lot to gain from giving the Asian American Church a seat at the table. There's a lot that can be gained in both directions. So I think more opportunities to share conversations, spaces where we can learn from each other. I hope that's afforded to us because I feel like we have a lot to contribute to this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Can you repeat the question one more time?
What do you want the Asian, like ministry leaders to know as they minister to young Asian Americans?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the ministry leaders to understand that the younger generation, they are spiritually hungry. They are spiritually hungry. This is a generation that not only is spiritually hungry, but they're looking for ways to make an impact. They're looking for spirituality to make a positive impact in the communities and not just be pulled off in this, focused on just their own members and their own comfort. So I would want the older generation, the ministry leaders, Asian American leaders, to dream big, to think of ways, get a vision from the Lord, to dream big, to use their resources to model how faith can make a positive impact in the communities all around. So that's what I would challenge the Asian American pastors.
That's what I would challenge. So you have to say that again.
Say that again?
You have to say that's what I would challenge.
Yeah, that's what I would challenge the Asian American pastors.
Why are they so loud? Say that.
Can I just add one more thing?
Can you say that? And then
Okay.
Say that.
Say that's what I would challenge the Asian American pastors to pursue.
Yeah, pastors, when you actually look at your congregation, they're such beautiful, gifted people. Recently I said something on the pulpit. Oh, I love reading poetry from time to time, especially when I'm kind of going through something difficult. I find lots of solace in poetry. I know your husband writes poetry.
Say, he's a good poet.
And almost like in 2 weeks after, I have 2 authors in the congregation who write poetry that's been published, and they offered their books to me. And it just reminded me just how gifted and able our congregation is. Mm-hmm. I think as a pastor, my job is to create platforms for them to stand on so they can be heard and they could take part in this great commission, sharing the gospel to the world.
Well, this has been a rich conversation. Thanks for joining this discussion and for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
For that, we'll look forward to the next conversation the next time.